been thinking?
Well, I'm Shaun Brauteseth, and this is I've Been Thinking, where I interact with some of the things that have been happening in the world around us. I want to think at the moment about the Olympics that have just ended, the Olympic Games in Tokyo. And I think the city's breathed a sigh of relief. There's been no major incident. They were very nervous about those games, and they've come and gone. But for two particular men, they never got to take part in the games behind the scenes, which was what they were meant to do. There were two Japanese men. One was the composer for the opening ceremony, and the other was the director for the opening ceremony. One of them had to resign. He was put under so much pressure, and the other actually lost his job. He was fired. And the reasons were this. For one of them, a video surfaced of a joke that he'd made during a skit he'd been doing that had been filmed. It was actually a joke about the Holocaust. And for the other, he'd actually done an interview where he'd recounted some bullying that he'd been part of when he was younger, in part bullying a disabled boy. And he'd recounted this to the magazine, and that interview had resurfaced. Now those things were terrible. There's no excusing those things. But the irony, of course, is that they happened, one happened 23 years before the clip of making light of the Holocaust, and the bullying episode was recounted 26 years ago. The actual bullying happened even further back than that, in school. And so these men lose their jobs, and the world actually celebrates. This thing didn't really hit the headlines in a big way. And the reason is it's not big news anymore for people to just lose their jobs over something that happened years and years ago. And the reason is that the world is trying to use unforgiveness as a tool to teach. It's trying to teach people that they mustn't step out of line, they mustn't do anything wrong, or they will never be forgiven, they will never be able to come out from under that. Well, the problem is that God is not like that. And the problem is when the world goes down a road like that, God is not at the end of that road. And so it can never bear the right kind of fruit, and it will be useless. It will continue on down that road, and it will never have a true effect on people. But God is different. And I'm thinking at the moment of Exodus chapter 34, when God actually lays out who he is. He actually describes himself for the first time to the Israelites and to Moses, who actually didn't know his character yet. And he says this, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And then he said, well, he doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. He still does punish. But he said beforehand, I'm prepared to forgive wickedness, rebellion, and sin. He made that clear. And what an amazing thing to think. So who should be those who look at society and look at what happened to these two men in Japan and feel saddened by that? Well, it should be the people of God, because forgiveness actually sets people free. Holding unforgiveness against someone in order to teach them actually binds them. It doesn't do the job it's meant to do. Only forgiving sets people free. And I want to end with a story to illustrate that. In 2001, a man was apprehended. He was actually taken into custody, arrested. His name was Gary Ridgway. And he was this mild-mannered man. He looked like any guy you'd walk into an office and see a guy behind a desk. He looked exactly like that guy. But what he'd done in the state of Washington in America was he'd murdered 48 women over decades, actually, starting in the 1980s through the 90s. They caught him in 2001. And he pleaded guilty to these 48 murders. He knew he wasn't going to get away with it. And what they did at his sentencing hearing before they gave him his jail term, which was life forever, is they allowed the families of his victims to come and each have a moment at the microphone and speak to him and say what they wanted to say to him. Some of them had bottled up anguish and pain for decades. And they, one by one, you can see the video footage of this, people went and stood and addressed Gary Ridgway. And he looked at them and he sat stony-faced watching them. And people would get up and speak about their mothers, sisters, daughters, aunts, and how they'd lost them. And they often wouldn't even address Ridgway directly. They'd say, I want him to have a long and painful death. I want him to suffer. I want him to die. I want him to burn in hell. And one by one, they all came and said these things. It's a very natural human response. And then one man named Robert Rule stood up. And he said, he came to the front, and he didn't look like an impressive man. He was this big guy with a beard, and he kind of suspenders. He looked like the kind of guy you wouldn't necessarily take seriously. And he stood there, and he'd lost his daughter. She'd been murdered by Ridgway. And he said, there's many people here who hate you, but I'm not one of them. And then he said, you've made it really hard to do what I know God says I must do, which is to forgive. But he said, you're forgiven, sir. And the camera panned back to Ridgway, and he was crying because someone had stood up and forgiven him. And he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison, but maybe he will think to himself, this man invoked God and then he forgave me, and maybe there's a God who forgives. And who knows? Well, that's the power of forgiveness. Forgiveness sets free. The world is going down a road of unforgiveness that it cannot come back from. It can't fix anything. It's trying its own way, but we've got to do it God's way. God's way is we release to God, we forgive, and we see what God can do in people's lives. It's the only way, and it's the way that God will bless when his people embrace it.
The end!